So my guest today is Tim Wright, who is a senior pastor at Community of Grace Church in Peoria, Arizona. He also has authored two books. One is an ebook, Dad Matters, and then one that I have with me that my boys and I are going through right now, which has been fun, The Adventures of Toby Baxter, the River Elf, the Giant, and the Closet, which I'd love to chat a little bit about. But you also are co-hosting a podcast, which I just found out about about a week or so ago when I was trolling you, finding out more about you, and with that you host with Michael Gurian,
Yes.
and it's called The Wonder of Parenting. Is that correct?
Yeah. The Wonder of Parenting podcast, a brain science approach to
A
parenting.
brain. Yes,
Yes.
awesome. And so I brought the Michael Gurian's book just so when people, I guess that's not quite the what the picture is on you guys's website or your podcast, but anyways, I just started listening to it, and man, it's so awesome. I
Well,
mean,
good. Thank you.
yeah, I'm just chewing through them and stuff on resiliency, and there's so much that I've sports, summer breaks with kids. The list goes on.
Yeah. Yeah. Most of as you know now, most of our podcasts are built around questions that people ask.
Yeah.
But, parenting issues are parenting issues. And there are a lot of parenting podcasts out there, really good ones. And we try to, Michael's specialty is boys, first of all, and the brain differences between the ways the boys learn and girls learn. And then we put all that together with best practices and our own experiences and hopefully come up with a mix that's helpful for people.
Yeah. And it is great. It's a well done. It's really easy to digest. I know it's a lot of information.
Yes.
But it doesn't seem overwhelming.
Well, that's very nice of you. Thank you.
Yeah. So it's been fantastic to listen to, as well as this book of yours is a lot of fun. And my boys just were drawn to it as I started reading, because I mean, it brings in superheroes. It brings in Lord of the Rings and Narnia style of things, Sword in the Stone. I mean, we were talking about last night, all the things that we're drawing from it, and it's fun.
Good. Well, thank you. I enjoyed writing it, and I'm actually just finishing up the manuscript for book 3. So it's been great fun writing.
Awesome. Well, good for you. And you are, how long have you been married?
Jan and I have been married for 43, coming up on 44 years this August.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a feat in its own.
Met in high school.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah.
Good for you. And then you have 2 adult children, and you have 5 grandchildren.
Yes. So my daughter, our oldest, Alicia, is a lawyer by training and is working right now as a prosecutor for Maricopa County. But her real passion is to do legal work on behalf of sex trafficked individuals. So she's studying for that right now. She and her husband have 2 of our grandkids. And then my son is a podcaster, and he does something called the Fantasy Footballers Podcast. And they hit it at the right time. They're one of the top rated sports podcasts in the country, and is making a good living talking about fantasy football of all things.
Well, that's awesome. And my son has probably listened to him, because we were talking about joining up with some friends and family around fantasy football.
Yeah.
And so he's my firstborn. So he is like digs into everything. Once he finds something he wants to do, he is 100 miles an hour and very narrowly focused.
Yeah. Well, I will, if afterwards, just send me his name and I'll get Mike to say hi to him if he's listening in.
Oh, I will do.
Yeah.
I will do. We'll remember that. So I didn't know who you were until about 3 weeks ago. And a friend of mine who's been listening to the podcast said, hey, you really should try to get Tim Wright or Michael Gurian on, because he went to a seminar of you guys's, and it just blew him away. And he, he's sending people books and of you guys's, and so then I was like, okay, well, I'm going to try, I'll reach out. And so I am very, very glad that you are here. And yeah, like I said, since then I've been digging in, and so you've done a lot of work with, and that's one thing I didn't mention it with rite of passages,
Yes.
and you've developed a program called Following Jesus.
Yeah. So just the background on that.
Yeah.
Uh, 19 years ago, almost 20 years ago, I uh, was sent out from the church where I'd been the associate pastor for 22 years, a large Lutheran megachurch, and we started a new congregation.
Okay.
And one of the first things that I came across was a book written by a guy who's now my friend, David Murrow, called "Why Men Hate Going to Church."
Hmm.
And David came to our church to speak, and he only preached for 8 minutes and held eggs in his hand. And what he talked about was how boys are leaving the church in alarming rates. And he kept dropping these eggs. And he said, in the 8 minutes that I've preached, this represents the number of boys leaving the church. Turns out that 70 to 90% of boys will leave the Christian church in their teens and early 20s, and most of them won't come back. And it's probably more than that now since COVID hit.
Hmm.
So I was really moved by that. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I remember reading an editorial by Michael Gurian, a New York Times best-selling author, Michael Gurian. And so I just wrote to him and I said, I'm a Christian pastor. Michael's Jewish. I'm a Christian pastor. The work that we do with boys and girls in Sunday school setting is similar to what you're doing with training educators. Would you be willing to talk to me about how we can do a better job reaching our boys? Didn't expect to hear back. And he wrote me back the next day. I actually hired him as a consultant to begin with.
Okay.
And we spent several weeks together. And he finally said, what do you need? What does the church need? And I said, I think we need some rites of passage. We've kind of lost the art of rites of passage. And after that discussion, he and I started creating the master program, which is called Following Jesus, a Hero Quest for Boys, which is for boys, middle school boys and their dads. And then we created a similar one for girls, Following Jesus, a wisdom journey for girls, similar program, middle school girls. And then out of that, we created some spin-offs for families that maybe aren't faith-based. And in the process, we became great friends. And we've been working together for about 16, 17 years now. The podcast is one of the things we do. The speaking, he and I usually speak, not a lot, but he speaks. This is his job, but I get to tag along once in a while. And the main thing that we do is a thing called Helping Boys Thrive. There are a lot of resources out there for our daughters, not a lot of resources for our sons. And so it's not about boys versus girls. It's about saying, hey, our boys need some help too.
Right.
And they're in trauma and they're in pain. And what can we do to begin to speak life to our boys along with our girls?
Wow, that's fantastic, and I love it that you found a spot that needed help.
Yeah.
Why are these boys leaving the church in droves, and what are you finding is the reason why?
Well, there are a lot of reasons. Um, Coming out of COVID, just a lot of, especially young families, just dropped out of church. If their churches were in lockdown like ours was for about a year here in Arizona, they just got out of the habit.
Hmm.
Prior to that, I think that there were some things, and I think in David Murrow's book, Why Men Hate Going to Church, there were some insights into that. A boy's brain is wired to take in information visually and through movement and through competition. Most churches process information verbally rather than visually. We do a lot of sitting, maybe some standing during the singing of songs, but it's really the way that most church services are designed today do a much better job of speaking to the way that a female brain is wired, a lot of verbal emotives, versus more action, movement, visuals that engage boys and men. And so, uh, at the risk of sounding a bit pejorative, a lot of guys, a lot of boys say church is for girls.
Hmm.
And even though that will sound like a negative, what they're saying is a reality. It's geared more toward them. And these are challenges that we see even in our schools. Reading levels for boys are way behind the reading levels of girls, in part because we insist that boys read books that are more suited to a female brain. Not always. There are a lot of girls who don't like the books either. We don't allow boys, for example, to read comic books, even though it's a great way to get boys engaged. Adventure books, or even books with what we think is violence, are sort of not allowed in schools. And so these are the kinds of ways that we sort of miss our boys. And then when we focus too much on words that are emotional, how are you feeling? How does this make you feel? A boy's brain doesn't access that nearly as quickly. You ask a girl, how are you feeling? She can instantly process with both sides of her brains, her verbals and her emotives. You ask a boy, how are you feeling? It could take him anywhere from 15 minutes to 2 days to
Right.
answer that question,
Right. Yeah.
because we aren't working both sides of the brain at the same time. And our brain tends to be compartmentalized. So when you put all that together, even though it's good for boys to talk about their feelings, that's not what we're saying. It's not as easy for them to do it. So, for example, a simple thing to do with a boy is, instead of saying, what are you feeling? You say, what are you thinking? What do you think about this?
Mm.
And that puts them more into where their brain is processing. And of course, it's always much better to ask a boy a question when you're moving. So you want to get something out of a boy, you want to have a big talk, go out for a walk, or
Yeah.
go play basketball, or play catch, and then just start having a conversation. That opens up his verbals.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've found that definitely with my boys, for sure. I have, my oldest boy is like me. He is, um, well, all my kids emote a lot. But we can talk. He's a
Yep.
talker. I'm a talker. So and he's been used to me asking him about how he feels and what's going on in his body and stuff. My second son is not like that. He's like, and when I ask him how he's feeling, he truly just, I don't want to talk about it.
Yep. Deer in the headlight.
Yeah, it really is.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm working on ways of, connecting with them. And I remember reading in, um, The Wonder of Boys, where he talks about, hey man, that car must really be feeling bad, to have been beat up like that. And, I mean, just transferring that onto something
Mm-hmm.
that they can see that is not them. So they're not talking necessarily about their feelings.
Right.
And I thought that was pretty awesome.
Yeah. And it's a good point you're bringing up. When you talk about boys or you talk about girls, brain science teaches us a lot, and it captures maybe 80%, you know. Um, and then you've got the 20%. I'm a verbal guy. I make my living verbal. I speak a lot of words. I write a lot of words, more than the average man would do. But as Michael likes to say, even though brain science gives us some ways of understanding a male brain, if there are 3.5 billion men in the planet, there are 3.5 billion different ways to be a man.
Yes.
But there are some general things that we share in common as male brains that we don't necessarily share in common with a female brain. Again, the way that we bond is more shoulder to shoulder. We bond through razzing each other or through competition. Girls tend more to bond just sitting knee to knee, looking eye to eye, sharing their thoughts, their verbals. One's not better than the other. They're just very different, and they can be complementary in the way that we inhabit the world. But when you talk about brain science, people get a little bit nervous because they're afraid you start to stereotype, which isn't that at all. Actually frees us from that and enables us to look inside and, all right, so why does my son think differently than my daughter, and what's going on there? And why is it that my son can sit in the exact same math class or English class as his sister, and he doesn't get it and she does? What's going on with the teaching method? For too long, we've sort of said the problem is with boys.
Right.
The problem is with the system, not with boys. And that's one of the great insights Michael's been sharing for over 30 years, is that we can turn our schools and our learning around quickly just by adding a few little things into the teaching day where boys can move.
Yeah, sure. So, and really, what it sounds like you're talking about is that the brain science is just a way to say, hey, let's be curious about our kids. Let's understand why are our boys
Mm-hmm.
engaging the way they do, or not engaging, or disengaging, and really. Once we start to understand some of those, and like you said, they're general rules
Yep.
about the average boy, um, or the majority of boys even, yeah, how can we take what we know about them and access parts of our kids that remain locked unless we do.
Right. One of the great joys I have when I'm with Michael, because most of the people that we speak to will be educators. That's where his real niche is. We get a number of parents as well, but most of our educators, as we know, preschool at least through middle school, are female, about 90 some percent,
Yeah.
and probably 90% of them have never been taught brain science. They just assume everybody learns the same way. And then for these teachers to sit and hear Michael show brain scans, and here's a boy's brain, here's a girl's brain, here's a boy's brain at rest, here's a girl's brain at rest. And you just see the light bulbs going off for these teachers. And they say, oh, well, no wonder I can't keep my boys interested, or no wonder I have such discipline problems with my boys. If I just did this, this, and this, it'd be great. And at the same time, no wonder our girls are not as uh, up to speed in STEM as our boys are. There are some brain science reasons for that, and there are some things we can do to help our girls get caught up in STEM, just as there are things we can do to help our boys get caught up in literature and reading.
Yeah, sure. And I imagine that there is, even when educators hear this, even when parents hear this, and same with me as well, when we process this information that's coming at us, we're hearing stuff that it's probably hard to hear and then make sense of it, and um, not be prone to our biases, because it seems to me anyways, from my perspective, that we have some sort of a war going on with, it has to be this way or this way, that
Right,
masculinity is toxic. I
right.
mean, I could probably just say masculinity is, and people could fill in that blank, is toxic. You've mentioned competition as being a mode for boys to interact and
Mm-hmm.
to engage and to learn. Talked about violence or aggression. I know the two are different.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I imagine when you bring that forward to educators, they come with their preconceived ideas of what should and shouldn't be, and those, like, especially when you talk about aggression and competition, that's kind of a tough one to hear, because, oh man, how do we engage in this? These are the things that we're trying to, like, push down in
That's
boys,
right. That's right.
right?
Right. Which is contrary to the way that boys are wired.
Yes.
And so it would sort of, if we said, you know what, the best way to educate girls is to make sure they can never talk. We're not going to allow them to talk. We're not going to allow them to share their feelings. People would be up in arms in a moment with that.
Right.
But if you say we should not have as much competition in school and we can't let the boys roughhouse, everybody's thrown up their hands saying, yeah, let's do that. But then what you're doing is you are depressing the way that boys are created to interact in the world. So you need boundaries, of course. You're not going to let boys go out and start boxing each other. That's not the point. There are a lot of ways to do competition that even girls enjoy. And the interesting thing about Gurian's research, they've been doing it for over 30 years. When you start implementing uh, little practices in your classroom that help boys learn better, not only do their grades go up, but a girl's grades go up as well. Because a girl's brain is wired to transition far better into learning modes than is a boy's. So girls can transition into competition far easier than most boys can transition into high verbal conversations that are emotive.
Wow.
So girls have an advantage in that sense. So this is overstating it, but almost any learning technique that works for boys will work for girls. The same is not true about almost any learning technique for girls will work for boys, because the way our brains are wired to process things in compartments rather than holistically. Again, that's not a bad thing. That's just the
It
way
just
guys are. And so, and Michael has done this for 30 years, so he's masterful at being able to try to help people overcome some of those initial fears about masculinity. And one of those is toxic masculinity, which is really an unfortunate phrase
right.
in our culture today. To say that masculinity is toxic. So basically, what we're saying to every single male out there, by the fact that you're masculine, you're toxic. Well, that's not a message that boys will live down to that.
Oh yeah.
And the interesting thing is when I talk about toxic masculinity, I'll have moms. I'll say, okay, moms, how many of you are raising toxic boys? Well, nobody thinks their boy is toxic. What we've seen in media are some toxic men.
100%.
Not all men are toxic. The overwhelming majority of men are not toxic. Are there some things in masculinity that we stereotypically feed into, that boys should never cry, boys should never share their feelings? Maybe, but could the same be said about girls? There are certain things that we allow girls to do that aren't always healthy for them, like ruminating over and over and over and over again about the same issue, which
Mhm.
is, we call it girl drama, and it's a real thing in the way that their brains work. Well, we want to break them out of that habit. We don't say that it's bad, that they're bad because they have that habit. We just say there are healthier ways to do this. So I think your raising of toxic masculinity is sort of a great metaphor for the challenge our boys are facing in this world, where it's just manhood is labeled bad, so boys are bad, and that's not what we want to say.
Yeah.
We want to lift up uh, the goodness and the strengths and the gifts that masculinity brings to this culture. And the reality is, if you took all men out of the culture right now, it would implode, because there are just certain things that men do far more often than women. Uh, for example, 90% of all the jobs where your life is at risk are men. Well, you take 90% of men out of the fire force or police officers or military, we're not left with much. So the men play a very, very important role. Of course, great educators, great thinkers. Uh, so I appreciate you bringing that up, because it really has been damaging. Uh, and I read an interesting article on CNN. It was written by a mom, and she said, I've really tried hard to inculcate into my boys sort of my feminist attitude, and they need to treat women with dignity and respect. And she said, and suddenly I realized my boys aren't toxic. In fact, I'm not even teaching them how to be boys. I'm trying to force them into a female way of living. And she really needed to step back and say, these are boys. I need to raise them to be boys. And that was a
Yeah.
great insight that a lot of moms, a lot of educators are having. These boys aren't toxic. There are some toxic men out there, but these boys aren't toxic. These boys are, in the language of Christianity, created in the image of God, created for good manhood. And that's, what Michael and I and many, many people are committed to, is to raising those kinds of boys.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that you're bringing in some of these details. And, so, the intention of this podcast that I am doing is kind of my time, as an older brother, raised in a home, a single mom home. I
Mm,
had 5 younger siblings, and, some drug addiction, some suicide. And then as I get out into the workforce, I was a teacher prior to becoming a firefighter. Um, and being around a lot of young men who were struggling with many things.
mm-hmm.
And then I entered into being a firefighter, and one of the things that I do is a peer support. And so they found that if a man can, or anybody can, talk about a stressful event that they went through within a certain period of time, 24 to 72 hours, then they have a better chance of not putting that weight on them and keeping
Mm,
it, and chronic stress, PTSD, suicide, and all that. And then, and then you just hear and you see the rhythms of the world that are saying, hey, on one hand, you want to be the alpha male, you
right.
want to tie up your bootstraps, you want to be the guy that hits first, hits harder, you're strong, you're driving a, jacked up truck, you're drinking beers on the weekend, and you're talking crap to people. And then the other side is, like you said, they're raising boys to be more like girls, more
Right.
like women, and neither one of them is completely wrong, right? Men are, like you said, we are aggressive, we are competitive, but we also do have emotions that we don't know how to express and deal with. And that is what I've seen harm many of the men that I work with, is that they just didn't have words around what they were doing. They
That's right.
didn't have anybody teaching them that it's okay to have these emotions other than anger. And so we're trying to train up these men now who, they're already grown men, trying to go back and create an atmosphere of, hey, let's talk about our emotions, let's talk about our mental health, let's get this off there. um, but some of the things that I have done wrong in my time as a parent in coaching is, hey, we don't, this isn't about competition. Comparing ourselves to others is a thief of joy, and you hear those, and there's some truth to that.
Hmm.
But I would, we don't keep score at a young age for kids, but they're keeping score.
They're
Like,
keeping.
hey,
That's exactly
yeah,
right.
we're whipping these guys, And so, anyways, the point is that trying to take all of these things and say, hey, we are raising a whole man.
Hmm.
Jason Wilson, I don't know if you've heard of him before. Um, he he has a books called oh man, it'll come to me. But anyways, he talks about the comprehensive man, that we can
Yep.
be, that we can be kind, but we can also be, we can strong, we can be aggressive, but we can also be compassionate. And really that's the desire. And I hear that in what you're talking about,
Yep.
is that we're just trying to understand boys, and how do we engage them and bring out the created being in them.
Yeah. And for those of us who are Christian people, we look at Jesus, um, and certainly he modeled what what manhood looks like. You have these moments where you have Jesus weeping with because of a broken heart or the loss of Lazarus, for example. You have Jesus who is at the center of the party and yucking it up with everybody else. You have Jesus who is standing tough against religious legalism. You have Jesus whose heart breaks when a woman is caught in adultery and is about to be stoned to death, and he steps in and fights for her with grace and compassion. So Jesus wasn't afraid of any of that kind of stuff. Um, what really it is for us, as you just said, to be able to help our boys do it in a way that boys are created to do it, and to recognize that boys will do it in different ways. Um, and Again, when we talk about helping men speak about their emotions, there's a way to do that that's very different again from the way that a female brain may do it. It's not that men don't want to talk about their emotions. We just need to help them process emotions the way that they process emotions.
Yeah.
And you mentioned anger, which oftentimes is really it's condemned as the wrong emotion to have. But for a lot of men, that's their starting emotion. And years ago, when I was going through some counseling, my counselor said, "Do you get angry a lot?" And I said, "No, I don't get angry a lot. But I hurt easily. I wound easily."
Mm.
And he said, "Hurt is simply, or anger is simply the expression of woundedness. It's the cry of pain." And so when you see men who are angry, there's a wound there. And so how do we help that man then begin to process that wound? Um, Again, it might be just going out shooting baskets with the guy. And then you start talking, man, I've noticed you've been angry a lot lately. What's going on? And yeah, but because his brain's now activated to start talking. Some guys are great in therapy. You can sit down with a guy and just say, "How you doing?" And boom, an hour later, he takes a breath.
Yeah,
But
that's
that's
me.
not, yeah, but that's not most men.
Correct.
So we need a variety of ways to deal with these men who, like women, are struggling with stuff, are created to process that, but just created to process it differently.
Yeah. Yeah. So all the things that you've been talking about are really a beautiful segue into rite of passage,
Yeah.
where it sounds like you are in, and you can talk more about it, but intentionally bringing a young boy along
Mm-hmm.
into being a man, which is a huge breadth of things to cover. But um, yeah, if you just want to, want to talk to us a little bit about
Sure.
rite of passage, what should be in rite of passage, some pitfalls,
Mm-hmm.
and I'll jump in if I need to.
Yeah. So rites of passage go back almost to the beginning of humankind, when tribes and villages recognized that the way that a boy enters into adulthood is very different than the way a girl enters into adulthood. Girls have a monthly physical rite of passage that they go through called a period. And they know their hormones begin to change, their bodies begin to change. Um, and so they know something's going on in their bodies. Now, they may not necessarily be able to process all of that. That's why you need women around them. But they know something's happening. It is possible to be a 40-year-old boy walking around in a man's body. And and cultures realize that boys need to be trained strategically into what a good man looks like. Otherwise, they'll make it up on their own. And so, culture after culture has had different ways of doing that. You'll have some tribes, for example, they might, one of the ones that I read about, they really create the pageantry of it. And so, a 13-year-old boy is sitting in the tent with his mom, and all the women are around, and she's got her son in her arms, and she's not going to let him go. And the men in the village come, led by dad, and they rip him metaphorically and literally out of her arms to move him from the world of female and feminine to the world of masculine. And then they'll take him out for days, and they'll just take him from one challenge after another. Um, Now, sometimes when women hear these stories, they're sort of horrified, but
Yeah, I
uh,
can imagine.
so they might just drop them in the middle of the woods and say, "Hey, we'll see you tomorrow. Good luck." Right? Now that doesn't mean that they completely abandoned him. They're going to be around, but he may not know that. But the purpose of a rite of passage is to have a boy face challenge after challenge, be mentored, process what it means to be a good man in that tribe or culture. And then when it's done, men and women come together and they welcome the boy back into the community now as a man. Our Jewish friends, Michael Gurian, being Jewish, they have what we call a bar mitzvah. And a Jewish boy goes through a period of religious training for a few years. And then the big challenge he faces is leading a worship service in front of his family and friends. I went to one. Interestingly, I grew up in St. Louis Park, Minnesota, which was 30 to 40% Jewish. So most of my friends were Jewish, but I never went to a bar mitzvah
Mm.
until Michael and I were working in rites of passage, and he took me to a bar mitzvah at his church up in Spokane, his synagogue. And there was a 13-year-old boy who led a 2-hour worship service in Hebrew.
Wow.
Now, I speak for 15 minutes, and I'm a paid professional. And that boy is up there for 2 hours, and then he led more worship the next day. So that's their rite of passage. And so, again, the purpose of a rite of passage for boys, and we now know we need them for girls as well in this new world, the purpose is to strategically walk our boys through whatever process it is that will instill the kinds of qualities that we believe in our family, our church, our synagogue, our tribe, are the values that would make for a good man. There's the boy will face some things that will challenge him. He's going to develop some resiliency. He's going to fail. He's going to get back up again. And the many of the great heroic stories that we read, like Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, Percy Jackson, Harry Potter. Those are all rites of passage stories set into a fantasy world. And it's really about boys or hobbits going through the process of facing their fears, being taught by mentors. At some point, they're on their own, have to make decisions, and they face their greatest fears and come out the other side, and they are changed by that process. So we don't have a lot of those in the United States anymore. And so Michael actually wrote a book called The Purpose of Boys and created a rite of passage model using the word heroic. And then what I did was I took that and wrote a curriculum around it. The first one, again, was for churches, for them to use with their boys and their men, and then one for the girls. And then we've taken parts of that for families who maybe aren't spiritual, Christian, and they can use some of the same questions in that. So for the boys and for the girls, the rite of passage we created is heavy on activity. So the teaching may go 5 minutes, and then there's a break or some sort of activity to get the brain recharged. Sometimes competitions. And you got to teach boys to learn how to lose and to learn how to win. And both of them are really important lessons. So that's kind of what a rite of passage does. And because we don't have them, boys tend to look for them.
Mm.
And oftentimes it will be at college in hazing experiences or seeing who can get the most beer down themselves. And the first one to pass out is the manliest, or the first one to sleep with 6 girls tonight is the manliest. Boys will make up their own rite of passage because they're looking for someone to tell them they're a man. And if good men don't tell them, then they're going to ask their friends, and their friends don't know, so they'll just make it up.
Right. And that's how we end up with gangs and addicts.
Right.
And alcoholics and
yeah. Gangs are a great example of that. There's a lot of reasons why kids go to gangs, but one of them is because they want to prove their worth and their value. They maybe haven't had a woman or a man, for that matter, speak life into them and say you're created for something good. Now, we understand addictions and all that take us down different paths, and even people in loving homes can become addicts.
Sure.
But there is something about intentionally training our boys and our girls for adulthood. It's a lost art. And I think in many ways we're sort of reaping some of the benefits of that with kids now really getting their identity from social media influencers, rather than mom or dad or a coach or grandparents. I think that there are ways that we can speak into our kids that will give them some substance that will hold them.
Yeah. And so are there components that should be in every rite of passage? And when I say components, when I'm thinking about a rite of passage for my son, he's coming up on 13.
Yep.
Was going to do it last year, but it just it didn't seem like it was the right time. It didn't seem like he was ready. So with the components, I'm thinking of, delving into our faith.
Yes.
I'm delving into, how to treat women.
Yes.
How to use your aggressions. I told him that at 13 he has to train in some sort of martial art or physical
excellent.
sport,
excellent,
so that he can use it and we can talk about it, and it becomes a tool and not an identity, or and walk him through how to use your aggression, so it doesn't become violent, and kind of work against that. Violence begets violence, which is is not true. And then and introduce some men in there, in our community that are in his life. But some of the things that are there some other things that I should think about?
No, I think that's really excellent for a dad who wants to take his son through a process. You've articulated, first of all, what you wanted in the end is give your son a vision. This is what a man looks like. For me, son, this is what a man looks like. Now, in our program, we use the word heroic, and each letter stands for what we think is good manhood. So we've got honorable, which means you do the right thing; enterprising, which means you just keep going, you keep your commitments,
Mm.
and so on down the line. And so those are sort of the 6 values, and then we do activities around that. We talk about that. So that's the vision part, right? You want to instill a vision. You want to surround your boy with good men. They need more than just dad's voice. They need to hear voices that are a little different. You know, it would be good because you're a dad who was very verbal and very emotive for them to hang out with some men who maybe aren't quite that way. You ask them a question and they just give a monosyllabic answer, but you
Yeah.
see what kind of man they are in the way that they interact with your son, or the way they interact with their spouse or with their children, or the way that they are generous with their time.
Mm.
So they can see different models of manhood, and one may be more who they are than others. So a vision, so surrounded with mentors, you're giving your son a task, which is the martial arts. So you always want to give the boy some sort of challenge that will stretch him. Now it can be something fun, um, like we're going to jump out of an airplane tomorrow. But when you're doing a challenge, you want it to, usually want it to have some meaning. And so what you're doing is really excellent. You're doing martial arts where he's going to learn again how to harness his aggression. He's going to learn some values around that. He's going to learn ways to be more defensive than offensive in terms of relating to um, pushback in his life. And then usually, once the rite of passage is over, there's some way to mark the event.
Mm-hmm.
You do that in a couple ways. One would be some sort of party, a celebration with the family, and a gift that's given as a reminder of that moment. Um, so, for example, I did it wasn't, I don't call it a rite of passage. I did a ceremony with my son. He had just had his first child, and I was really new to this rites of passage stuff, and so I thought I'm going to try something. So for 2 or 3 weeks, I just got out a pen and a journal, and I just wrote every day anything that came to my mind about our relationship together, a little bit about my life, his grandpa's, what it was like when he was born, just anything that would tell his story. And then I invited his grandpa, my dad, who was alive at the time, his Mike's father-in-law, my brother, Mike's uncle, and then a good mentor friend of Mike's over to my dad's house. My dad, every family has a world famous something, right? My dad's was world famous chili that the world never knew about. Um, and Mike didn't know any of this. So I went over to his house and knocked on the door, and he answered. He said, "What are you doing here? Is mom okay?" I said, "Yeah, she's fine. I just thought I'd come over and invite you to lunch." "Why?" I just thought we'd get together. "No, I'm not stepping out of this door until you tell me what's wrong." I know he hates surprises. So finally, his wife walked out and said, "Mike, they're going to do something really cool with you today. So go." So we went, we just ate chili. We talk about stuff that guys talk about, which is virtually nothing and everything. And then we sat in a circle, and each of those guys had written a letter to Mike. 3 things that they've learned about being a dad, and then a word of blessing to Mike. "Mike, this is what we pray for you." And then we got in a circle, we prayed for him. I gave him my journal. And then to mark the event, Mike and I went and got matching tattoos, father tattoos, that I had designed at a tattoo artist that my son wanted desperately to go to, but had never been to before. And so the design had some of those metaphors for dad, the benevolent king, the good warrior who fights for his family for their best, and the heart representing love and compassion, a cross in the center of it. So that's one way to mark, right? He'll always have that,
Yeah.
but it could be a cross, it could be a book, it could be a photo, anything that marks the event, so that that boy knows I went through something significant, and it's not the end of the story, it's just the beginning of the story. Because at 13, you can train them all you want, they're not men, they're still
Yeah.
boys.
Yeah.
But
Right.
you want to at least give them a foundation, and then you just keep coming back at it. Every significant milestone in their life, when they turn 16 and they're going to drive a car, when they turn 18 and they graduate, when they turn 21 and go off to college or whatever it might be, or graduate from college, when they get married, when they have a kid. Mark the event somehow, have a little ceremony, and just mark those events and use it as a teaching moment. Okay, son, you're a dad for the first time. Let me tell you my experience being a dad, or let me tell you what it was like for me the day that I got married, without grossing them out. And all those different moments that you've had experience in, and other men have. These are great teaching moments that you can mark in different ways and create little ceremonies around them.
Wow. Yeah, that is awesome. And is there a place for people to find
Mm-hmm.
your literature on the
Yes, if they go to
okay.
timwrightbooks.com, timwrightbooks.com, they'll find the rites of passage there. I have just finished a revision of the boys program.
Okay.
I've taught it uh, at least 10 times, and so I've gone in now and made some revisions. I'm just about to finish the girls' revision for the major church program. So that those will be on there if they want to wait a week or two, depending on when this podcast comes out. So timwrightbooks.com, and that's also then where they'll find that book you mentioned that you're reading with your son, which is a book written based on rites of passage.
Right.
So rather than using the whole word heroic, I just use the word hero. And so Toby Baxter goes on a rite of passage experience into a fantasy world. But that's the whole point of the book, was to put to story what the rite of passage program is doing in another way.
Okay. And as as men who are listening right now and wanting to take their boys through a rite of passage, are there some pitfalls, some things that they should look out for, as they're going through this, some things to not do? Um,
Well, that's a good question. I think just the fact that you're doing it, big pat on the back. Um, and if you've never done it before, probably you would want some sort of resource to help you. Now, one of the things that, and I'm not trying to push my products here, but
yeah.
one of the things that Michael and I did in the church rite of passage, it's created around a big group where the dads and their sons do a big activity around, say, the letter H, honorable. And then dad and the son during the week have what we call their little huddle or fellowship. And we created questions for dads to ask their sons around each of those 6 heroic character qualities. We actually took those questions out of the program and created a little mini rite of passage for dads, so that if they just want to go in and order the questions, we have them both for faith-based and for secular dads. And that might be a great start. So if you're looking for what kind of vision do I instill in my boy, I'm not quite sure what conversations to have, that would have some conversation starters. And each of them is also created with a little activity you can do together, to sort of just build relationship. You can bring mentors in with you on those conversations or not. But that's one way to start. I think the hardest thing for dads to do is to think through, well, what information, what qualities do I want to impart to my
Yeah.
boys? How do I have these conversations? And so we wrote them up for people if that's helpful for them.
Okay. And and are you doing this as a father and son, and then they have mentors that you bring in, or are you doing them with, there are a number of sons and a number of fathers that are doing this, going on this journey together?
Yeah. So in the church program that we created, the full program, which is 7 big sessions, 6 small group sessions. The guys read through the Gospel of Mark together.
Hmm.
They memorize 6 Bible verses. They have to do a Jesus project and present that. There's a lot of things that go into that program. That's done with dads and with boys together. Big group stuff, and then the dads and the boys go off on their own for the small group. I have done that now for me. The most boys that I've had at one time go through it with their dads was 4 boys. So you have 4 boys, you have 4 dads, maybe some mentors. So about 10 to 12 guys. And it's worked really, really well, because you can do the competitions with that many people, whether it's tug of war or cornhole or rock, paper,
Right.
scissors. And so that's how that church one works. If you were doing one just using the questions, for example, um, you could do that, just you and your son. Maybe bring in grandpa or an older brother or a coach, and just say, we're going to set aside 6 hours together. We're going to 1 hour a week or an hour and a half so that we can build in some playtime. And we'll do it. We'll play a little bit. We'll go out and we'll get your favorite ice cream. And then we're just going to sit and talk about things that are important to us, things that we want you to think about as you start moving into 13, 14, 15 years of age, just to give you some substance, some foundation, because you're going to have a lot of voices in your ear these next few years, and a lot of people saying, go this way, go that way. We just want to give you something so that you can make wise decisions. And so that's what just the question, rite of passage, so to speak, is for, is just to do it in that sort of more intimate setting. You could certainly bring some other dads and sons in, but I think the question time, those questions are really designed for a dad and son, or dad mentors and son, not a
Yeah.
group.
Yeah. That's good. Um, Man, this has been a great conversation. I just, is there anything today that you would feel remiss if you did not share, things that you would like to talk about?
Mm. Well, you asked about what are the various parts of a rite of passage. So the most important one is this: for a boy to hear over and over again from a man who's important in his life, I love you, I'm proud of you, and I want you to know you are really good at whatever he's really good at. There's a thing called a father wound. And a father wound is a heart, we'll keep it in boys' language, a boy's heart that never heard dad say, I love you and I'm proud of you. And boys will spend the rest of their lives trying to fill that wound. And my dad was one of those guys. My dad had a deep father wound, didn't pass it on to us, but he lived with it all of his life. His dad was an alcoholic. And some guys fill that wound with other men who speak life into them. Some guys, quite honestly, fill that wound by getting themselves into trouble or by becoming workaholics to try to prove their worth. And so the most important aspect of a rite of passage, and even if it's not a rite of passage, it's throughout that your son's life to hear over and over again, especially, son, I love you and I'm proud of you. And when you catch your son doing things that model good manhood, say something as soon as you can. Son, I am so proud of you today that you stopped and actually made sure that your sister was okay today.
Mm.
That's what it means. I'm so proud of you for doing that, or that you helped mom put groceries away today without being asked. Wow, that was amazing. Son, I know you only got a C on that paper, but I know how hard you worked on it. And it wasn't because you slacked off. You really worked hard. I'm proud of you for that. So those are the things that we want to constantly do. Obviously, we want to do that for our daughters too, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But we're talking about boys at this point. And there's something about a boy hearing that from a man. It means a lot when mom says it, but moms are supposed to love us, right?
Right.
Uh, but for dad or grandpa or a coach or a pastor just to walk up and say, for no other reason, I just want to tell you something. You're just an amazing young man. You're just amazing. I love being around you. And it will set him up for life.
Yeah. Yeah, that is important. One of the things that you said, and I know I was getting to the end here, but you you had brought up, um, that your father carried his father wound with him,
Yeah,
but did not pass that on to you.
right.
Would you mind sharing a little bit about what that? I mean, if you have a little bit more
Sure.
time, share
Oh,
what that
sure.
father wound looked like, how it kind of manifested
Yeah.
itself in your life, and then how that chain was severed
Hmm.
from your father to you.
So my dad's dad was an alcoholic. And my dad was the second born of 4 kids. He had an older sister, then came my dad, then came his brother, and then their younger sister. And my grandpa abandoned his family.
Mm.
And so my grandma in the 1940s is raising 4 kids on her own, which back then was really something. And every once in a while, my grandpa would try to come back into their lives. And one time, this is according to my dad now, one time when my dad was older, they actually got in a fist fight. And my dad said, "Don't you ever come back here again." Ironically, my grandfather remarried and ended up being a great dad to his second family, horrible dad to his first family. And I didn't know my dad carried this father wound until I got older and understood father wounds. And I'll explain in a moment, but there was a poignant moment. This was not long before my dad passed away. We were doing a thing, Quest for Heroic Manhood, which is a 24-week manhood study. Really, really amazing work. And the guys were in small groups, and the question was, who is your hero? And I happened to walk by my dad as he was answering. He said, "My hero is my father."
Wow.
And I just stopped and what are you talking about? And as I listened in, he said, "My dad was a fighter. My dad never gave up." And I thought, wait a minute, your dad was a drunk. Your dad abandoned you. You had a fist fight with your dad. And it hit me that what I was hearing at that moment was a little boy desperately needing to be able to look up to his dad. And the way that I saw the father wound play out in my dad was very successful. Almost anything he did when it came to sales, he was at the top of his game. He was the number one salesperson for Prudential Life Insurance. And then he was man of the year for another company. But my dad would then work himself into failure. And no matter what he touched, it would be successful until he worked it into the ground and blew it up, almost as if he was afraid of being successful. And I interpreted that as a cry of a guy who just didn't have the internal fortitude of his father's blessing to continue to succeed. And he worked and pushed himself so hard trying to prove his worth to his dad that he would end up imploding. Now, fortunately for my dad, my mom's dad, my other grandpa, who was a pastor, so I had an alcoholic grandpa and a pastor for a grandpa. My mom's dad became a surrogate father to my dad. And my dad never called him dad, always called him chief.
Mm.
But they really loved each other, really respected each other. And I think in part because of that relationship and because my grandma who raised my dad was a woman of faith and had to be a woman of chutzpah. She died when I was a month old, so I never got to meet her, but had to be an incredible woman to hold a family together like that. I think all of that, he was able to sort of, even though he had this father wound, he was able to not pass it on to us. He was invested in our lives. He was supportive of our dreams. He came to our games when he could, and so and we got the blessing from him all the time. "I'm proud of you." Sometimes it would come in letters. Sometimes it would come just in his words. But we always knew that Dad was proud of us. And so this was a man who sort of lived a contradiction in a sense. He had his own father wound, and never really quite dealt with it. He kind of knew he had it, but never quite dealt with it. And yet he wasn't passing that along to us. And I think that's probably true for a lot of men out there. They may be pretty good dads, and yet you still see some things once in a while. You think, why are you doing that? And then if you dig deeper, you might find out Dad never said "I love you," and they're just their heart aches for that significant man to say "I'm proud of you." And if a boy doesn't get that, he'll try to find it somewhere else, and often it will be destructive, trying to prove his worth.
Yeah, which goes back to how you started it with, our draw to competitiveness or draw to
Mm-hmm.
aggression, seeking out that
Yep.
affirmation, right?
Yep. 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 Well said.
Man, this has been really an awesome conversation. I asked you on here, with hopes to talk about a rite of passage, and you did so much more than that, because you talked about the heart and the minds of boys and how they are coming into this world, and then that brought us into why is it so important to have that rite of passage, and then to end it with your story about your father and his
Mm,
wound, really again just to me just says it is so important for us to be intentional with our boys, for us
mm,
to hand down those things of I love you, I'm proud of you, and you are
mhm.
really good at these things, and be um yeah, just be, planting those seeds that he is enough as a man.
Yes, he is enough. That's great. That's so well said.
Well, gosh, Tim, thank you so much.
Yeah.
This has been a wonderful journey, and um, thank you for being willing to come on. Thank you for the work that you are doing, because it's growing fruit, and I will pass this on, your book and your rite of passage work, and yeah, and listen to the podcast. If those who are listening to this podcast, please go over and listen to The Wonder of Parenting, science-based approach to raising boys. It's fantastic. Thank you so much.
Well, that's very nice of you. Thank you, Marty. I love being on the show, and any son who loves my book, that's a son who's been raised well. That's good fathering.
Well, thank you. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. God bless you, sir.
Thanks, and
Yeah.
you too.
All right. Thank you.